Hi everybody, Patricia Warby Alchemy Therapies here. And today I want to do a quick book review of a book I've just finished reading. And that's this one. It's Suzanne O'Sullivan, It's All in Your Head. It was a Wellcome Book Prize winner in 2016. I've only just come across it. And a well-deserved winner, actually. It's subtitled Stories from the Front Line of Psychosomatic Illness. And Suzanne is a neurologist based in the UK in the NHS. She works as a consultant in the NHS. And she's talking primarily from the view of a neurologist and the sorts of disorders she sees, which are high level, about 30 to 40% are what we call dissociative or conversion disorders. Things like seizures, which are often believed to be initially epileptic, turn out to not be epilepsy at all. And she's talking really about what the distinction is. What is a conversion disorder? Well, and it's an old term, actually, conversion. Basically, what it says is that emotions are translated into physical symptoms. And the point of the title, I guess, It's All in Your Head, is both what people sort of think about when they think of a psychosomatic illness, that they've kind of made it all up. But it's also very true that your brain is controlling this to a large degree, and it's controlling where the symptoms occur and how severe they are and when they strike. And the problem with having that diagnosis, as Suzanne quite clearly says, is that people feel that you're saying you've made it all up, or you're doing this to yourself as if it's a blame game, which isn't really what psychosomatic disease really means. It means that there's something psychological, and when you think of that, also think of emotional, that is translating into the soma, the body. And because this artificial division of mind and body that modern medicine has is part of the problem, really. That a physical problem must be purely physical, or a mental problem must be purely mental, is, of course, a complete nonsense, because the body doesn't work in segments like that. It's a holistic total. So I thought it was very interesting. And there was a short section on chronic fatigue syndrome, which is my specialism, where Suzanne obviously isn't as perhaps as knowledgeable on chronic fatigue syndrome, because neurology doesn't tend to get sent that. You tend to get sent to rheumatology or endocrinology when you have a possible diagnosis of chronic fatigue. But I thought what she did manage to say is that people who get diagnosed with these conditions, because there is no model that explains them, often get left behind, and they often get worse over time. And that's exactly what I see. Because look, if you've got a condition, I don't know, something that isn't understood and known about, diabetes, for instance, you have a plan, you have medication, you have consultation and assessment, or you should do. But with something like dissociative disorders of any kind, you are left kind of feeling like it's a non-diagnosis. It's like it doesn't really have a plan. And you can feel a great deal of shame also with that diagnosis, because it feels like you've somehow caused it yourself. And that isn't what dissociative disorder means. And so I really wanted to do a piece on this to explain why stress-related illness, which is what we're talking about here, is a very real thing. It's very physical. It's not made up. It isn't something you're doing to yourself deliberately. It's an unconscious response. And we really have to understand that the majority of your brain is unconscious, and it will create situations for you. Well, think of it. If you don't think about breathing, you don't think about digesting. These are things that go on unconsciously all the time. They're normal functions. But the brain is also able to create meaning from your life experience and from what's going on around you, and interpret things and create a response which it believes is appropriate. Now, the problem is that being unconscious, it's not something you'll necessarily be aware of. And Suzanne is very clear about this, saying in the book that most people who get ill like this aren't aware that they're under stress. Most of them would say, no, my life is good, or it's just getting really a lot better. Maybe they're in a difficult job, but they love it. Or they're in a situation with family that feels like, there's a lot to juggle, but it's what you always wanted. The unconscious stresses are more to do with what the pattern is that your brain has based your life on. So the unconscious response is looking for pattern matching, and it's saying what happened to this person when they were young is the blueprint, if you like, for how they respond to things later on in life. And so if, for instance, you've always wanted a family of your own, but the family you grew up in was unsupportive, or they didn't get you, or they deliberately undermined you, then there'll be an unconscious conflict and a fear, unexpressed consciously, but there anyway, about what might happen should you create a family of your own. If also one or both of your parents modeled overwork, exhaustion, if there was financial stress, and you are in a high pressure job as an adult now, the unconscious stress will be, will I end up like them? And it won't be voiced. You won't be aware of it. You'll just be focused on getting ahead and doing the best you can. So these things work subtly, and the body, remember, can't talk to you. It doesn't have a language. The only way it can express its pain or its distress is by giving you symptoms. And so symptoms are information. That's what they are. And where they occur is very interesting too. And they'll often move around the body. So symptoms often start early in childhood, sometimes in the teens, with gastric issues, gut problems, skin issues, allergies, and so on. So they're what we would call sort of surface presentations, if you like. They're distressing, but they're not life-threatening. And then as time goes on and nothing is done to change the pattern, then the pain or the distress is communicated in a deeper way. And so then you might get joint pain or back issues, chronic bedwetting, things like that sort of are going deeper. And because growing up, you don't really have control over that, and you also don't have anything to compare it with, apart from maybe your friends, and maybe they're not suffering, or maybe they are. You don't know what's normal, and so you have nothing to say to yourself, oh, this isn't right, this is just the way things are. And so you'll often continue the pattern unconsciously throughout your life into adulthood. And then the symptoms may change yet again as the stress is increased, because there's no doubt about it, adulthood has a lot more stress in it, probably. Depends on your childhood, obviously, but in general, we increase in our stress load as we take on more responsibility for life. That's how it should be. And you'll find the symptoms move and develop. We call it the symptom imperative, because they're trying to tell you something. And what modern medicine does is it says, well, the symptom is the issue. So if it's back pain, that's where the problem is, and we need to scan you and test you. And nobody ever asks you, what stress are you under, or what happened to you in childhood? Because that's one of the most fundamental questions, as the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, found out. That was a study done in I think the end of the last century, actually, 1999, I think it was. But it had massive ramifications for how we understand stress-related illness. We saw that what happens to you in childhood is one of the main determinants for your life course, for how well you function and what illnesses you're likely to have, and indeed how long you're likely to live. It's a massive, massive factor over and above every other factor. It outstrips smoking, exercise, diet. It's just massive, because it creates these unconscious stress responses. So I found the book to be fascinating. I mean, I have had clients with seizures, and it's been very interesting for me to learn how a neurologist views that, because it was always in the back of my mind that the seizures my clients were having were probably to do with stress, emotional stress responses. But of course, I wasn't qualified to say that. But now I've read this book, I feel like, yes, I was on the right track. And so many of her clients, most of them are female, by the way. I think she's got a couple of men in the book, but that's reflective of the nature of these illnesses. It used to be called hysteria, by the way. Back in the 19th century, it was considered to be a form of hysteria, which was put down to having a wandering womb. Believe it or not, scientists actually believe that the womb was an organ that moved around the body and caused all sorts of problems. We now know that is obviously not true, and it's a typical blame the woman kind of for her physiology approach. But obviously, women do suffer more from these conditions than men do, and we have to ask ourselves: is that the nature of the female psyche? I believe there is something in that. We tend to be more attuned to our environment biologically. In order to raise children, you need to be aware of what's going on in your environment, and our brains are subtly different to male brains. So it could be that. It could be that the society we live in tends to dump stress onto the lowest members of society, and whether that's your ethnic group or your religious group or your gender. It's still true that women carry the majority of stress in our culture. And so I think there's that factor going on as well. But how they're treated, of course, in medicine is that these conditions are not valid. And so people end up feeling that they have been dismissed, and therefore they seek more and more tests. And that's something she goes into a lot of detail. And we see that this is costing billions in terms of all the unnecessary testing that's going on, because people simply cannot believe that something so physical can be caused by emotional stress. And well, I'm here to tell you that it absolutely can. It happened to me. It took me a long time to get my head around that and to understand that it wasn't my personal failing, but how I had been trained to respond to stress. My system goes into overdrive. I'm what's called a highly sensitive person. And that's a category of people. It's whether it's nature or nurture, I'm not quite sure, but there's probably 15 to 20% of the population who are highly sensitive. We just have a greater appreciation of stimuli. Our brains are very highly attuned to stimuli. And we fill up the doctor's offices, and we are the majority of patients because we suffer from this psychosomatic issue. And so we need to address sensitivity. We need to understand what it is and deal with it appropriately, and not dismiss people and say that you're making this up and it isn't real. So I highly recommend the book. It took me a few days, probably about a week, to read. It's obviously based on case studies. That's the nature of her role, obviously, but a very, very well-written book. You can tell that she has a vast amount of experience, I think 25, 30 years of experience. And it's such a humane story, really. To understand how people suffer is really important to help people heal. And that's what I do. And so if you're interested in contacting me, my contact details are always in the description below. And if you're interested in the book, it's available at all bookstores, and I highly recommend it. Thank you very much for listening. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody.